Welcome to the 2022 HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript crash course. Now, of course, this is referred to as front-end development, and front-end developers make a lot of money. So we're going to take the design that you see here, and we're going to make it work in the browser on the desktop, on tablets, and also mobile phones, as you see. So first, we're going to take a quick look at this actual mock-up that was designed in Figma by a UI designer, myself, and then we're going to take a quick look at what HTML and CSS is and what the structure looks like. But then we're going to spend the rest of the course, which is the bulk of this crash course, on actually implementing this, and I'm going to, as much as possible, try to introduce you to the concepts, assuming you're a beginner. Now, by the end, your head's going to be in a whirlwind. You're not really going to fully understand everything, but if you just want a taste of what it takes to be a front-end developer, then this crash course is right for you. So let's get started. Now, before we begin, if you find that you're really interested in learning more and learning properly from scratch, then I want you to visit DesignCourse.com/CSS. It's here in the link in the YouTube description. And here, at the time of recording this, it's not yet available, but we are creating the most interactive and fun CSS course that will teach you everything from scratch. So if it's not yet released, based on whenever you watch this, please enter your email here to get notified when it does release, but it might be released. So if that's the case, look for a discount code here in the YouTube description to get access to the CSS course here at DesignCourse.com. Also, if you're interested in UI, UX design and learning actually how to design great looking websites, that's also currently available at DesignCourse.com. Again, look in the YouTube description for that. I'll shut up now and let's get started. All right, so let's go ahead and get the obvious out of the way. I am a floating head today, and that's because I just chose to wear a green shirt. I hit record, and here I am, a green, rather a lack of a green shirt and a floating head. So anyhow, let's get started here. We're gonna talk about our HTML structure. This is just a few slides to make this go real quick. This is just gonna be real fast. I like to get our hands dirty. I don't like to do this theory stuff, but it would make sense real quickly to talk about HTML and CSS structure and how overall it is structured. So first, this is an HTML element, basically, and this is how most of them look. In the context of a full web page, you're going to have possibly hundreds of these, and you can nest them inside of each other and do all of this cool stuff. So let's break this down. So first, we have what's called the opening tag and the closing tag. Now, some HTML elements are self-closing. In other words, they don't have this little ending portion right here, and it would essentially just be this opening portion. But most of the time you're writing HTML elements, they're going to have an opening tag and a closing tag. Next up, the HTML element name is defined right after this less than sign. And so this one's called div. There are many, many, many others, dozens, if not over 100. After that, we have the attribute. So inside of an HTML element, sometimes you can have attributes, and sometimes you don't have to. Class is an example of one of the many attributes that you can use. Now, some attributes allow you to specify, or most rather, a value of some sort. All right, so in this case, it's hey. It's whatever you want to make it, and it's how you can reference it in both JavaScript and CSS in order to style it. Now, right here, sometimes, and I'd say most of the time, you have content between the opening and closing tag of your HTML document. All right, and now let's say, for instance, we're talking about a whole HTML document itself, like index.html, which you may have seen or may not have. This is the overall structure of an HTML document. So you have the opening HTML tag here, and the closing. So that's always going to be your first line and then your very top line. And then inside, we have two major areas. You have the head section, and you have stuff in here. And the stuff in here is really just configuration stuff. So for instance, the top of the browser, there might be a little title there. You specify tags in there, the title tag. You also have meta tags for the search engine and stuff like keywords and the description that shows up in the Google search results. You also have an area where you can specify or link a CSS document that helps you style the stuff that's down here. So then you have the body element, and inside of the body element, that's where you're going to be working most of the time. So this is where almost pretty much all of your HTML elements and those tags is going to be within the body tag. With whatever is within the body tag is what actually shows up in the browser on your desktop, computers, and also on your phones and stuff like this. All right. So let's talk about CSS structure now. So this here is what CSS essentially looks like. And this overall right here is a rule set. In a big example where you have, a full website, you may have hundreds of these rule sets, just different rule sets to style different parts of that HTML document. All right. So CSS, by the way, is nothing without HTML. If you don't have the body element or any of the stuff that's inside the body element, then CSS means nothing. HTML is the skeleton of your body, and CSS is the flesh. All right. It's how you configure the appearance of HTML. And I'll show you what HTML looks like without CSS, and it just sucks, right? It would be really weird if we saw a bunch of humans walking around with just skeletons, right? So think of it like that. All right, so this is a rule set, this whole thing right here, this whole block. So let's break that down. All right, so the first part of this rule set is called the selector. There are several ways that you can create selectors, but basically what it's saying is, all right, in the HTML document and the HTML elements that we're looking at, which element are we trying to style? All right, it's that tag name. So in this case, notice how there's a period and then it says hey. Well, in our previous example, when we were going over HTML, we had this right here. Well, if you're trying to reference this element and you're trying to style it, like give it a background of blue and make it a font size of 1 unit, well, then you would say, if you're referencing a class, period, hey. So the period means a class. So by the way, if you're not sure what the class attribute means, a lot of this stuff I'm kind of glossing through pretty fast, but just to give this a definition, let's say you have multiple elements in your HTML document that you want to style something about them similarly, you give them a class. And this is one of the use cases. Now you could also, as a selector, just choose div. You could put div right here without the period. And that means you're creating a selector that's based on an HTML element itself in the name of it. And that means anytime you have a div element in your HTML document, whatever is defined in here will be defined on all of them. Next up is what's called a declaration. All right, it's basically a property and value pair. You can have many declarations within a rule set. All right, so this one's going to make the background blue. This one's going to make the font size 1 unit. And you can literally have dozens upon dozens of declarations inside of a single rule set. So like I said before, now we have a property, which is a part of that declaration. And of course, we have the value right here. And that is essentially it. That's a very quick rundown of the structure of both HTML and CSS. At this point, if you've never touched it before, I don't expect you to really understand it because you don't have the context yet. You haven't actually written it and haven't been able to see what it does in the browser. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to get our hands dirty with actual HTML, CSS, and working to build a design that we saw at the very beginning of the video. Now, in order to write HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and many other languages, you need what's called a code editor. Now, right now at the time of recording this video, and this has been the case for at least several years, the most popular code editor to use is from Microsoft. It's called Visual Studio Code right here, and the URL for that is code.visualstudio.com rather. And this is the most popular, and guess what? It's free. All right, so I'm gonna want you to go to that URL, code.visualstudio.com, and download it for your OS. Of course, there's for Mac OS, and there's also Linux available for you hackers who use Linux. And then download it and get it installed. So pause this video, get it installed, and then come back. So in order to get started, assuming you have Visual Studio Code up as well, and by the way, just a quick thought here, if you're really interested in development, it's going to help you tremendously to get 2 monitors, all right? And for me, I hate working on a laptop. Many people do it, no, that's fine. But if you really want to be as efficient as possible and you're at home or you're at an office or whatever, get a second monitor, because you can put your code editor on one monitor, and then on the other monitor you can have your browser, which is auto reloading every time you're making changes to it. And that way, when you're working on a website or a web app of some sort, you can just switch back and forth. Because otherwise, if you only have one monitor, then most of the time you're going to have to come down here and then click in order to show up your browser, and you have to switch between back and forth of them. So let's go ahead and get started here. What we want to do is we have to create a folder in order to store our new website. And so what we want to go to is View and then Terminal, right down here. All right, so right here, this by default in Windows is going to put you in your username folder. I have a folder in there called Code. So if you don't have it, you could type mkdir code. I'm not sure what that same process would be for Apple. I've never used Mac ever, so yeah, just Google it if you don't know how. So we're going to go to cd code because I already made that, and then we're going to make mkdir a new folder, and in here we'll just call this my new LP for landing page. A landing page is like the first page, like the home page basically. So now we're in there. Now we can type cd my new LP to hop into there. And now we can just hit code period, or we could just hit open folder just to show you what code period does. When you type that, it just gets a Visual Studio Code instance, like another copy of it, out here in your browser, or on your desktop rather. Yes, I trust authors. And there we go. Now we can see where it says my new LP. This is the folder that we're currently working with within our instance of Visual Studio Code. So now we want to create our index.html file. So index.html, let's close that little window right there. And this is where we write our code in the code editor. As you can see, this index.html is highlighted. It's currently selected up here. So one of the great things about Visual Studio Code is what's called Emmet, E-M-M-E-T. If you do a channel search on my channel here on YouTube, you type in Emmet, you'll see a crash course I did on it. But basically, it helps you write HTML faster. So one of the first things I do, it is the first thing I do. Whenever I'm starting off a new HTML element, or document rather, I just put in a shift exclamation point, hit enter, and there we go. It creates the quick boilerplate code that you would otherwise have to write by scratch or by hand, essentially. So as we can see, there are some things up here like the doc type HTML. You don't ever touch that. You just leave that there. Here's the HTML tag right here. Here's the closing one, so the opening and closing. And then inside of it, we can see this stuff. All right, now we have, like I showed you before, the structure. We have the head with a bunch of stuff in it, like the meta tags, as I mentioned before, and also the title. And then we also have our body element, and this is where we're going to be spending most of our time writing stuff. All right, so there is an extension that I want you to use here for Visual Studio Code, and it is called Live Server. Now, what's cool about Live Server is if we go back here, after you install it and you reload your instance of this Visual Studio Code, you can right-click our index.html and put in, and left-click rather, open with Live Server. When it does that, it's going to open up whatever your default browser is, mine's Chrome, and it's going to show you what your HTML element looks like, or your document. Right now it's just white and there's nothing in it because we haven't specified anything within those body tags. What's also great about it is whenever we make a change to this document and we save it with Control S, it'll automatically refresh this for us. That's why it's really handy for us when we're working with this to have two monitors. But of course, I'm not recording on two monitors, so I am going to have to probably go back and forth. In a little bit, I will probably show this right here and then the code editor over here. Okay, so what we want to do when the first thing we want to do actually is to get our CSS document ready as well. And typically, when you're dealing with a structured project, you'll have a CSS folder because you might have multiple CSS files to write your CSS in. So we're going to create a CSS folder called CSS. So you click this little plus folder icon, and then you click the new file icon, and we're going to put in, we can name it something like main.css. Some people name it index.css, whatever you want, and that's good. Now, for the purpose of this tutorial, I am kind of going a little bit ahead of what you probably should be doing at this point. And we're going to not write, we're going to write CSS, but we're going to write it in Sass. So I know this is confusing you. Sass is just a way to write CSS in a more efficient manner. But really, I'm only going to use one feature of Sass, and that is nesting rule sets within each other. You can't do that with plain CSS as of yet. And so I'll show you what that is. But otherwise, everything I'm doing is just plain CSS. But in order to do this, we have to right-click this. We're going to rename it. And so we're going to change it from main.css to main.scss. All right, now I have this little Sass icon. That's the logo for Sass. Showing up because I have an extension called the Live Sass compiler. So if you type in Live Sass compiler right there, you want to go ahead and install that. Once it's installed and reloaded, you can click Watch Sass. All right. So what this does essentially is when you write inside of your main.sass document, for instance, you don't have to do this. If I type in body background blue, and I hit save, you'll see it creates two other files. Ignore the map file, but the main.css file, that is what's going to be linked or referenced here for this HTML document. So we're going to type link and then enter. That way we don't have to write all this other stuff that's necessary for this HTML element to work. So the href is the attribute. That's one of many attributes. Content is an attribute, name, many different attributes like I mentioned. We're going to reference that file location. So it's in a CSS folder / main.css. We can just click right here. So now if I go back to the browser, it is blue, a very bright, horrible blue that might make you blind. But that's how that essentially works. So we're writing our CSS in this Sass file, but it's all getting compiled down into this other file called CSS. And so just to show you one of the benefits of being able to write in Sass, and one of the core features that the primary features of Sass that I'm going to use is the nesting. I can show you an example real quickly. So you don't have to follow along. I'm just going to put in P, like for a paragraph, hello. I'm going to hit save. So what I can do now is I can say P, and I will say font weight bold. All right. So if I go back here, it is now bold. It's pretty small, probably hard for you to see, but this nesting you cannot do regular with CSS. So for instance, if you look over here, notice how they're not nested. All right. So that's just, it's for organizational purposes, essentially, for the most part. So that's why I'm doing that. I did want to explain that a little bit. All right. So going back here, now what we have to do is we need to, and now also you can specify a nice title like my new LP, whatever. That's what'll show up like on search engines and all that stuff, and also on the browser title or the browser, the bar that you actually click and drag around. So now what we want to do is actually take a look at our design and then start writing our HTML. You got to have your HTML first before you start writing your CSS. All right, so here is the Figma document. I'm going to go ahead and actually link this in the YouTube description so that you have access to this so that you can look at it as well. And this is typically how you would be doing in a professional setting. Very rarely do you just start off designing a website when you're working with your HTML and CSS. You want a mock-up, preferably done by somebody who's a good designer. If you want to become a good designer, remember, visit DesignCourse.com because that's what I teach as well. But nonetheless, outside of the spam right there, you want to look at an actual polished, preferably high fidelity document where it's going to show you, what you want this to look like. This is all we're going to do. All of this right here, it doesn't look like much, but for a crash course, this is a lot to take in. All right, so this is the desktop version. And when I'm structuring and writing my HTML, I like to see the full experience, the full desktop experience. I don't want to look at the mobile version because mobile versions can leave things out intentionally because you don't have as much space. So it simplifies things. But for HTML, our HTML is always going to be the same, and we have to create all the HTML elements for the full experience. So I start from top down. All right. So when I'm thinking about how I'm structuring, things, it's starting from the top down. We don't work from the bottom up, okay, when I'm like looking at the structure of things. So the very first thing that I usually ask myself is, does this need any type of container? So by container, I mean, if we can visualize this, this isn't going to be a part of the design, but if I take this rectangle tool, we can kind of draw a bound right here, a bounding box around this whole thing that kind of just contains everything right here. So if I get rid of the fill and just give it a stroke, you don't have to follow along, by the way. I can make this, maybe we'll make it blue, and then we'll make it pretty thick. Let's drag this out to include that little hamburger menu icon, which actually this isn't going to be there during the desktop version. So let me remove that and we'll right-align it. There we go. So this is basically an HTML element that we'll want to include here for this design. So let's go over here and we're going to type in, if we want to write div class equals like a wrapper, sometimes it's called container. You can name it whatever you want, really, but you commonly see this as named for this sort of thing, this idea that we're wrapping everything around a central element. It'll be wrapper or container usually. So you could do this, or if you don't want to have to type out all those elements, you can use the Emmet abbreviation. So period for class, and then the name of it, and then hit enter. Automatically, it creates a div element. So div element is probably the one element that you will use the most when writing HTML. And it's just kind of like a generic element that's created for defining the structure of your layout. All right. So you'll see plenty of div elements, and their attributes primarily you'll see as just being class or ID. So you can also have multiple attributes, of course, in a given element. ID equals, you know, some unique ID. An ID is primarily used for JavaScript, though. You typically don't see people referencing IDs in CSS. Now, if you wanted to, you would just put, instead of a period, you would put a hashtag and then the name of the value that you gave it, essentially. I think I hit the keyboard, something like that. But you don't see people do that anymore. So we'll leave off ID. All right, so now we have that overall element. One thing I do want to consider is this photograph right here. Notice how, let me hide this real quick. Notice how we have the menu on top of it. So how do we show a photograph like this picture of a Nike shoe with stuff on top of it, like other HTML elements? Well, there's something, there's a CSS property that we can give it, and that is called position, and we can make the value absolute. And that means we can kind of just break outside of the box model, as it's called, and you can position and stack it like way in the background, and you can have things on top of it, like this element right here. And so when we do that, we can really position or place the HTML for this image anywhere in that HTML element. So I prefer just put it at the top. Now, there's two different ways you can actually show photographs or imagery, in a sense, that are from like JPG files or PNG files. And the first way would be an image tag. So if we type image source equals, this is where the source goes, kind of like href right here. Source is like where, you know, the actual file is located. Now, currently we don't have any image files in our My New LP folder. So we actually have to get that image, and I'm going to link this image in the YouTube description. It's a free image that you can use from an awesome service called unsplash.com. So right here, if you type in shoes, you will also find it. This is the graphic that we want, and we can just click over here and just choose medium, and it will download that onto your computer. Here in Chrome, we have this little element. Firefox has the same thing. We'll click on show in folder. And then what we do is we come over here, right click, reveal in File Explorer, and that will open up on my other monitor. And so we have My New LP. Now we double click into that folder, and then now we can have a new folder called images, for instance, or assets. You can name it whatever you want. And we can drag from the other element, which is on my other monitor, that picture right there. So now we're just going to call this shoe. Now we're also going to have 3 other pictures of shoes, and I'm going to link those as well. You can use whatever you want from Unsplash, and I'm going to drag them in here as well. All right, and there they are, shoe 2, 3, and 4. So now we can close this out, and you can see we have our images with our, different shoe pictures right here. All right, so let's close that out. And so now we have our image source. Now we could say images/shoe.jpg. Now the alt attribute is a really important attribute because whatever you put here, when somebody hovers over it, for instance, they'll be able to see a description of it. But also for people who are using screen readers who are visually impaired, when they're navigating through the website with their keyboard, it will actually give them an audible reading so they can hear what's happening essentially on this website. So we can just say red Nike shoe, shoe rather. So we'll save that and we'll come back here, and here is our document. Oh, there's that big blue border, which we do not want. Let's just delete that right now. And here is the shoe. Now notice when I drag this in and out, it doesn't change. And also if I were to bring this up, let me try to find the bottom of my browser here. Wow, it's really large. There we go. We could see that it has scroll bars. So we could solve for that and remove these scroll bars and make this image responsive. The way we could do that is we can reference this image element by putting img here, opening that up, and we could say width 100%. So now, if we go back, we will see it responds kind of how we want it to. So that's the first way that you can display a photograph here, essentially in CSS. Now the second way, which is the way we're going to do it because it gives us more control over the image itself, is we're going to make it as a background image in CSS. So let me show you that real quickly. So the way we'll reference that is we're going to make another div element. Let's give it a class of hero-img for image. And by the way, hero means the hero section of a website is usually the first thing people see. So it's like the top of the website. And so now inside of here, we just leave it like this. We don't put any content in between this closing tags and the opening tag. We just leave it as is. And then when we get to CSS portion, you'll see that we will reference this hero image class right here and create a rule set in CSS, and we'll define the image there. We're not going to get to the CSS portion yet though, but I wanted to kind of describe, my reasoning behind not using just an image tag. Okay, let's continue on. So referring back to our design, which is right here, the next thing we have is this portion right up here. So if I bring back our, let's get it over here, rectangle 2, and we view it, I can go ahead and get this situated right here. This is what I'm going to look at next. So this is our header, which has a brand like a logo left aligned, very typical pattern that you'll see that UI designers create. You see your logo on the left, and then usually to the right, sometimes in the middle, sometimes close to the actual brand is the navigation. So we have 2 elements, and notice how they're in a column. This is in a left column, this is in a right column. So they're not rows where they're stacked up on top of each other, they're columns. And that's an important distinction to make because that will influence how you structure your HTML. So in order to have 2 columns, you typically need to have a parent container. All right, so this blue element is a parent container. And if I duplicate this again, we have another element in our HTML for this right here, the logo. I know that looks kind of bad. And then we'll duplicate that and we'll drag this one over here. We're gonna have another element that contains these individual elements. So when you're structuring your HTML, think about it like blocks, like rectangles all over the place, because that's essentially what it is. That's how the browser interprets it. But then we can style it up with CSS and make it not look blocky like that. All right, so let's close that out. And there's also something called semantic HTML, and it simply means use the HTML tags that are relevant given the context of what's happening in your HTML document. So for here, we're going to give this what's called a header tag. And it's very simple. We simply put in header, enter, and then inside of here, we put the 2 columns. So the first thing inside, think of this header as, we revert back to here, this rectangle right here. Now we have, starting from left to right, the first thing that shows up is going to be this logo. Now this is a logo that is purely a word mark logo. So in identity and logo design, a word mark is just type. Now, the reason I know that is because I'm also an identity designer. Once upon a time, I did over 2,000 logos. But this, typically, you're not going to have a logo like this, though. Usually, you're going to have an SVG file, which is a scalable vector graphic file, like an asset that you put in that folder. It's an individual graphic file that hopefully the company will provide you with, and that is their logo that they want you to use. So typically, you would use an image tag for this. But for us, because it's just purely word mark based and it's going to be based on the font that's used here already in the document, we can just use and make it a link. And so we'll use the A tag, all right? And that's how you create hyperlinks or the things that people can click. Because another typical pattern is the logo should be clickable and it should take you to the home page or the dashboard or whatever it's associated with. So we're going to put in A, enter. So remember, get used to that using those M abbreviations. It makes writing HTML a lot faster. So the href is the location of where you want somebody to go when they click on it. This could be to an entirely different website, like website.com, whatever, or it could be into a different page on the website. So in our case, this would just be, in most cases, it would just be the actual .com of the website. So if this website for DesignCourse.com, I'm putting DesignCourse.com right there. You'll see it for the other navigation links that show up. We have 3 of them. You could also put this to a different folder on the website. So something like about, you could do that, or it can go to individual HTML files like about.html. You have different types, like you can do PHP, although that's old school. But anyhow, that's just for taking people to different websites or different pages on the same website. So if you don't want to go anywhere, just put a hashtag. There's also ways to take people to different parts of the same HTML document. It'll scroll down automatically. You've probably seen that. And you do that through tags. So we just put in like section 2 or something like that. And then you'd have to create a reference to section 2 somewhere else in your HTML document. All right, I know this is a lot. It's a crash course. So we're just going to leave this empty. That means nothing's going to happen. Not empty. We're just going to put a hashtag. That means nothing's going to happen when somebody clicks on it because this isn't a real website. So now we're going to also have a class attribute, class equals logo. This class attribute will allow us to reference it in CSS to style it up to make it look like it does in the Figma prototype that we've been looking at. Now inside of here, we have the content section. And so inside of it, we're going to put shoe. And then notice for a second, if I come out here, notice how one word is red and the other is black. Well, we need a way to make this red, just brand, right? So to do that, we can't just put shoe brand. We wouldn't be able to do that. Maybe with JavaScript we could, but that would be silly. What we would do is wrap brand in its own element as well. And a great element for that use case is span. So we take our span, make sure we put brand inside of it. There we go, shoe brand. And by default, if we look at the result, it'll say shoe brand. It's styled exactly the same, as you can see if I zoom up a little bit, but that's because we haven't styled it differently yet, and span doesn't have any inherent browser styling that's applied to it. That's something that we'll have to do. Next up, if we refer back to our document here, we have this element, home, sneakers, and players. All right. So we also have to account for the HTML that will inevitably show up right here for mobile. See, this little icon, which you've probably seen versions of, like when you're using your phone and you visit a website, you tap on it and then it reveals, a mobile-based navigation of these elements. Well, that's because you simply just don't have, in many cases, enough width or space on a small phone to show home, sneakers, players, and maybe even more along with the logo. So that's why we have to account for this. It's kind of like making the navigation dynamic. So we have to create an element for an HTML for this and also for these. So let's do that right now. So what we'll do is we will specify the first element. Actually, it doesn't really matter which we make first, that hamburger menu or the actual navigation. So let's do the navigation first. So for a navigation like this, you're going to wrap it, those elements, those 3 elements, which are currently on a desktop in 3 columns. So remember, we need to give it a parent container. We're going to wrap it in an element called unordered list. All right. So that's an acronym, obviously, UL for unordered list. And then we're going to put 3 elements inside of there. And so because we have 3 links, we have home, sneakers, and players. So an unordered list accepts sibling or nested HTML elements that have to be denoted as LI, list items, because it's a list. So list item 1, we just hit LI, hit enter, and then we put a link. So remember, to create a hyperlink, we put an A element. Hit A, hit enter inside of there, and then we're just going to put the empty hashtag because it's not a page, it's not real. Typically, you might put something like, the actual website address, because this is going to be a home link as well. So we link the logo and we put a discrete home link as well. And there's been usability studies about this. People expect to see a home link, and they also expect to see to be able to click on the logo to get to the home page. So inside of here, we just put home for the content. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, typically you could, if you wanted to, you could kind of separate these out. I don't like to do that. I just put these list item elements with links on the same line just to save space. Now, another big handy feature here in Visual Studio Code, if you want to replicate or copy and paste elements quickly, we could take everything, left click, hold it, hit Control C, and then Control V. But a better way is Shift, Alt, and down arrow key. So fast once you get it into your muscle memory. So now we have 3 of these, and we can specify sneakers here, and then also players here. All right, so there's one thing that I forgot. I forgot a certain element that I should not have forgotten. Remember how I said we need to wrap these elements. We do have these wrapped up in a parent container or a parent element of UL, these 3. But I also want to wrap, and this is for semantic purposes, this entire element right here and our navigation or our little menu icon within a nav element, which is a semantic element that will help screen readers understand that this is a navigation, and it will say, audibly to the person who's using the screen reader that this is a navigation right here. So we've wrapped that up. And we could also put in that menu. And so that menu is an illustration. It's an SVG file right here. So if we click on it, all we have to do is right click, and then we'll copy / paste as SVG. SVG is short for scalable vector graphics, and it's not rastered. So when you're talking about graphics in general, they fall under 2 categories. It's scalable, or it's vector, or it's rastered. Rastered is like when you've seen photographs sometimes are really pixelated and they look horrible, but photographs can only be rastered. But this is an illustration, so it doesn't make sense to make that a rastered image because an SVG is code. And so we can scale up the size in SVG however large we want, and we'll never see blurriness or pixels. So we're going to paste that, Control V, right there. So that's what it looks like. SVG is just code, all right, that we can actually paste into our HTML document. So that right there is looking good. Let's give it a class too of close so that we can reference and style and position and scale it in CSS in the future. And let's also get rid of width and height because we can set that in CSS as well going forward in the future. All right, so that's looking pretty good right there. If I hit save and we look at our HTML document, at this point it looks but ugly. It looks nothing like what we have going on here, right? Yeah, that's the beauty of CSS, because we're going to be able to transform it into looking like this once we get all the HTML ready and we start writing our CSS. All right, next up is going to be this section right here. So this is a part of our hero section, especially on desktop. This is the main part we see. And we have a headline, a sub-headline / description, and this little down arrow, which again is an SVG element as well. So let's go ahead and write the necessary markup for that. So outside of header, we're going to put in a section element. So this is just basically a section of content, and this helps, structure and organize your entire sections essentially. And we can reference this section in our CSS to give it white space away from other sections and things like that. So we're also going to give this a class. And we're going to give it a class because we're going to have two sections. We have that top section and then we have the bottom section down there. So we're going to do class equals hero. All right, and inside of here, what falls next is that headline that we have. So a headline is specified usually a million times out of a million times as H1, and you have H1, heading 1, all the way through heading 6. H1 is the most important, and usually that's in your hero section. It's the big bold text that grabs the user's attention essentially. So we're going to put regain your confidence on the court. There we go. Very solid. So now if we hit save and we go back, we don't see it. What is happening here? All right, that's a little bit strange. So sometimes weird things like this happen. It's not actually showing up in my browser because we should certainly see that type. And I'm actually confused at this point. And so I'm going to sit here a little bit and figure out why it is not showing me. Maybe we can go to view terminal. All right, it's not running in the terminal. If I right click open with live server, it's not showing up there. Now, what we could do when you have Firefox or Chrome, which I advise using when you're working with web development, hit Control-Shift-I or F12, and this will get up this little dev console. There it is. It was way down there. Now, why is that? Well, what we can do is we can use this little element right here, and this will help us see, and when we hover over, different things. And notice this big area. Why is that there? I can tell you why it's there. Now I understand, because I didn't know what was happening. See where it says SVG close? Well, that is actually because of this. We don't see it because it's white on white. All right, so that was a white little hamburger menu. Now, if we change this background, so we take our body background, let's say black, for instance, and we save it, we will now see this huge, and that's because we removed the width and the height attribute. So it's just making it really large by default. And so that's what was happening there. So nothing to worry about. We can delete that, come back here, and just keep on writing our HTML at this point. So now we're going to have a paragraph because we had a paragraph underneath it, or the subhead as it's called sometimes. We're going to give this a class as well because I want to style this individual paragraph as well. And we're going to call it subhead for subheading. And I'm going to simply copy and paste this so you're not sitting watching me type this out. It's just a shoe built with purpose to take your game to the next level, blah, blah, blah. And then finally, we have the third element, which is that little down arrow icon. So what do? We go back to our document here. We click on it, right click, copy and paste as SVG, and paste it in right here. Now, once again, we can go ahead and get rid of the width and height, type in class equals, and this will be down -arrow. We're going to make this actually animate as well. Next up, and by the way, we're almost done with our HTML. So we're going to have another section, and then that section is going to be based on this design that you see down here. All right, so we'll do section. We're going to reference that. Class equals, we'll just say more info or something like that. So you can put hyphens as well. And we have 3 elements occurring here. So again, just get some muscle memory here. We have 2 columns per row. We have 3 rows and we have 2 columns. So we have a column here. Let's get rid of that. And then we also have a column right here. So we need a overall parent container that contains both of these elements in HTML. Think about them as blocks or rectangles. So to do that, we're going to wrap each one in a div called feature. All right. Inside of there, we're going to have 2 elements for column 1 and column 2. That is going to be content. Because remember, look at our first one. And this one's getting a little bit tricky because the first element of the first column is our content, a title and a description. But then the next one, we're reversing it. And then we're going to have this here and that there. But we're going to style it in our HTML so that all 3 of them, including the middle one, start with our content in the first column. But we can use CSS, something called the CSS grid, to take just this second row right here and reverse them with CSS. Very cool stuff. Exciting. So to create that title, we could use like an H3 element. You can use multiple H2, H3, H4, whatever. But we can also just use a paragraph element as well, which is what I'm going to do. So the Emmet way of doing this, we want a P element or paragraph element with a class. We put P period and the name of the class or the value. So we're just going to say title. All right, so inside of there, we're going to say lightweight. That was the copy for the first one. Now let's go ahead, Shift Alt down, and then let's go ahead and put in here. You can copy and paste this. I'm just making all 3 of them the same. We just paste that right there. Now, real quickly, as an aside, you can go to the extensions and you can type in LOREM for lorem or lorem ipsum. I've already installed it. But what it allows you to do, if you don't have actual real text, you just want filler, Latin, fake text, as sometimes you'll see, it's called lorem ipsum. You type lorem and then how many words you want. So if I want 15, lorem 15, no spaces. And then we automatically get all of this gibberish that you cannot understand. All right, so we have lightweight. So yeah, we have that. And then we have the image next to it. So we have our first element for our first column already defined within feature. Now we have to have the image. And this time we will use an image tag. So image source equals images forward shoe2.jpg. And alt, you can just describe the shoe, whatever it looks like. And that's it. So we copy all of that, the whole feature area, and then we paste it 2 more times. Now, let's save that. We need a way, though, for us to reference this middle column to flip those 2 columns. And the way we'll do that is on the feature element, we're going to put a space and we're going to add another class name. So you can put multiple class names in the same class attribute. So this particular div element will have 2 classes, feature and also left. We can just name it left. You can name it whatever you want. You can call it flip because we're trying to reverse, or you can go reverse, whatever you want. So that's all we need to do there. And guess what? That is our HTML. That is the full HTML document. And of course, if we go look at it here, it looks really bad. Look how big that down arrow is. So that's why essentially, we want to use CSS to make our website actually usable, which is what we're going to do now. All right, so for the CSS portion of this video, which is what we're going to be focusing on here throughout almost the remainder of the video, as you can see, my format here for this layout of the desktop, you can see I have my browser window right here, kind of like in a phone orientation. And then you have my editor right here. And by the way, to have more room to actually code, we can hit Control B to hide that file area right here. All right, so you can always just toggle it on and off with Control B. Now, the reason I have this over here in a phone orientation is because we're going to do something. We're going to write our CSS, which is in a format called mobile first. So mobile first CSS. What does that mean? That means that all of this initial CSS, the initial CSS rule sets that we write are going to be geared towards what this particular website or app looks like and how it behaves and looks like on a phone or a device that has a little amount of width. Now for our actual Figma documentation, the prototype that we're looking at, there is no actual design for the mobile view. Now typically you would have that, but we only have a desktop. So we can make some design decisions on our own in order to adjust things with CSS so that it works and looks well on a phone. All right. Now the reason we do mobile first CSS as opposed to desktop first CSS is because when it comes to your CSS in your initial rule sets that you write that aren't a part of what's called responsive design or media queries. I know I'm confusing you right now, but I still have to plant the seed, is because you're starting off in a more simple manner. Because typically when you're working with and you're looking at a website that's on a phone like this, for instance, it's stripped down. It doesn't have to be as complex. So when we start to expand out this browser window, which can help us mimic going from maybe phone to tablet to full desktop, you're adding in more features and such, and we can do that in the media query. So it's just a practice that makes sense for me. Now some people still do desktop first, and I'll show you what that kind of means in code going forward. But for now, we're just going to try to get this thing looking good on a phone, and just taking your browser and pushing it in is one way to do that. Another way to do that, Control-Shift-I or F12, is we can take this right here and let's also click on this little cog. Wait, it's not the cog, I'm sorry. It's these little 3 dot menus. We could dock this thing wherever we want. We can also completely just detach it. You can unlock it. So if I click that, for instance, now I have a separate window right here. If you click this element right here, you could see now it's kind of allowing us to present it by default like in an iPhone X, for instance. And we can kind of see what it looks like. You don't have to use this way, but it's an option. So I'm going to redock this back. So coming over here, and I'm just going to put it, maybe I'll put it at the bottom. And now I can just exit out of it. All right, so here's our mobile view essentially. So the first thing I typically will start off with is the body element. Now the body element is the very first element in this tree, so to speak, you can actually go ahead and start styling. So it's the body element. What would we want to change about the body element, right? Well, it might be a background color. It could be a lot of things. We could set in a font family if you want to use a custom font for everything. Now, because remember, if we set certain rule sets here in body, it can affect all the elements that show up within it, that are nested in it as well. So setting your font family in the body element makes a lot of sense for most cases. All right, so another thing that we'll also do is we're going to reset the margins. So by default, the browser will apply margins. Now your margins, you have margin and padding, and that's a way to define white space. White space is just the empty areas. We can see there's a little bit of white space up here, but for me, it's not enough. So I want to put margin. Now that's our property, and then I'm going to put a value of 1.5 em units, and we're going to end it with a semicolon. That's how you end a declaration within a rule set. Hit save. Not much has changed, obviously. It actually looks almost exactly the same, but if we change this to like 10 em units, now you can see it doesn't look like there's much space here on the left, but if we scroll all the way to the top, there is a lot, but also there's a scroll bar at the bottom. That's 10 em units. That is a lot. So if we change this to 1.5, we can now see we have much more compared to what was default. So if we remove this, that's all we had. That's not a lot of what's called white space. So going back here and scrolling over here, the reason it's creating scroll bars sometimes is because we have issues with our images. They're not responsive yet, so, but don't worry about that. So what is an em unit? You're probably wondering, what is em? Well, there are many different unit types that allow you to scale things or define widths in just lengths, and they fall under two categories: absolute units and also relative units. An M unit is a relative unit, and I'm not going to get into a full description because I could do long videos just on this topic alone. But generally speaking, when you're dealing with margin and padding, you want to use M units. And an M unit is simply meaning, if we take a look at the default font size, again, if we hit Control-Shift-I or F12, and we take a look at our paragraph, for instance, we could see by default, which I'm not sure if it's going to show up here, but by default, browsers will apply 16 pixels or px, which is another unit that we could use, to things like type, like it's set on the body element essentially. And so our body element, if the default size is 16 pixels, one M unit is equal to 16 pixels. All right, now if I change it to 1.5, that means it's going to be 16 times 1.5. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, that would change if we changed font size, for instance, the font size property we overrode the default value that the browser gives it from 16 to like something like 25 pixels. And then in that case, we could see it increases this even more right here, even though we left it at 1.5. So it's relative. The reason you want to use M units for this sort of thing is because if people want to zoom up their browser, or if they've changed their operating system so that things are larger, everything in your user interface will scale well. If you leave it at pixels, it won't, like an absolute value like px, for instance. So that's just a quick rundown there. I know it's confusing, and this is a crash course. Like I said, you're taking in a lot here. I don't expect you to fully internalize all this at this point, but I'm planting seeds here, like I said. All right, so remember I'm talking about wanting to use a font. Well, if we go back to our prototype, which I think is right here, and we click here, we choose here, we can see this one's called Railway, actually. Actually, I wasn't even planning on using Railway. We're going to use a different one called Poppins, which I really like. So how do you specify a font? Well, we type in font-family, and then the name of it, Poppins. There you go. Problem with this, though, however, and it's going to work for me because I saved it. You can see it changed the font clearly from the default Times New Roman, which is a serif font, to the sans serif font of Poppins. Now, if you don't personally have this, or the person visiting your website doesn't have this font installed, they're not going to see it. So in that case, you can provide a fallback here in this value and just say sans-serif. So it'll choose the closest sans serif font. Sans serif simply means without serif. And a serif is like Times New Roman. It has all those things hanging off the letters. Sans serif is usually a cleaner font. It's much more simplistic, like this. Now, the way you force them to be able to download this font is we actually import the font. Now, this happens to be a font that's available on Google. So if we go and get our browser, fonts.google.com, this is a resource in which you have all these cool fonts that you can use. So let's type in to search for a font called Poppins. We click on it, and then we choose our weight. You know, like we want it really bold. Do you want all of them? No, you don't want all of them. Why? Because it takes time for these to download. So if somebody's on a phone and they have a poor connection, the fonts won't load right away. So you only want 3 max. I'm just going to choose 2. So I'm going to use light 300. Actually, you know what? I'm going to use regular 300, or 400 rather. And then also not 600. I want 700. All right. So when I do that, I think I clicked off of that little element right there. There we go. So we click this to get this up, and we can choose to either import it. If you copy this right here, you can just simply paste it in your HTML document. But typically speaking, you want to link it in your HTML document. So you take all this stuff, copy it. And then above your main.css, this link element, we just paste it. And then that way it's going to download automatically from your HTML element, and it will be available automatically here as well. So for me, ooh, interesting. This is no longer working, and it's showing that serif font. It's a serif font. So I have this cool browser extension. Let me extend this out. And unfortunately, I don't, oh, there it is. It's black. That's why I can, it's called what font. So if I hover over this, Times New Roman, Times New Roman. Why is this no longer working? It's not loading our Poppins font despite having, oh, wait, it says Montserrat. What is that? Oh, it's selecting two families. All right, let's get rid of that. Family equals Poppins. That probably didn't happen for you, but let's just save that anyways. All right. And it's still happening for me. So what you want to do is put a comma right here. Oopsie. So we're going to save that, and now it's coming back. So that's how you debug your HTML with the help of the Dev Inspector. All right. Or the Chrome tools. It depends on whatever you want to call it. Okay, so we got that done, and let's continue on with our next rule set. All right, so let's drag this back in. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the underlines. Nowhere in our design in Figma do we have links that are hyperlinks that are underlined. So how do we influence all links and remove the links from all, existing elements here on the document? Well, we simply we create a selector based on the tag name A, which is all links. We open it up and we give it text decoration, none. Save it, they go away. Awesome. Now we can also choose to style all links and make them even larger. So let's say 1.3 rem units. Now, what is a rem unit? We're using M units up there, rem units over here. So typically speaking, for font sizes, you want to use rem units or relative M units. And I can't go into the details about exactly how it works because it's kind of difficult to explain off the cuff here. But essentially, it allows you to control what this particular font size is relative to based on a font size that might be specified elsewhere. That's the best way I can describe it, but there's entire videos. If you go to YouTube, you can type rem versus M or Google rem versus M, and you'll get a better explanation that way. But just as you understand it for now, font sizes, use rem, margin and padding, use M. All right, so next up, we're going to have nav. And nav, if we look to our HTML structure, we have header up here. We have our A element, which is the logo. In fact, let's style the logo up. Let's style the logo up a little bit later until we get our image actually up, our hero image, that big red image of the shoe. So I think what we'll do is, let's do the actual image. So notice the image is right here. It's our first element. This doesn't have to be our first rule set either. So we can put these rule sets wherever we want in relation to each other. So let's actually get rid of nav and let's work on our hero image. So we're going to put period because it's a class called hero-image. All right, so this one has a lot of declarations. It looks like it's over 12. So the first thing, remember I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there's a CSS property called position, and we're going to make it absolute. So we're going to save that, and we're also going to put top 0, and top, left, right, and bottom are elements that you can use for position absolute. So you have to have position absolute in order for those to work. And it's just a way for us to position it. So top 0, left 0. All right. So let's make sure we are referencing everything. So class hero image. And the reason we don't see the image yet is because we haven't specified the background here. So let's put that in. So to create in a photograph or an image based on your CSS, we type in background, URL, and then we put in the location of the images. So if I hit Control B, we'll see that we have our CSS folder that this file is in, but then in a different folder adjacent to it is images. So we get out of our folder by putting 2 periods and a /, and then into what folder? Images / shoe.jpg. All right, so that image is there now, but we still don't see it because we haven't specified a width or a height. So width, we'll just say 100% of the browser. Now height, we're going to use a new element. It's called it's called viewport height, or VH. So 100 VH. There it is. Finally, we see part of this image, which clearly is quite large. All right. In fact, we don't even see most of it anyway. And so we still have some other elements to write. So viewport height simply means the height of what's viewable here currently in this browser. All right. Now we're also going to specify a property called z-index or z-index -1. Now what that does is that the z-index, based on the value you choose, which you can put negatives, will make it fall on top of or behind other elements that may show up. And you can only use z-index with position absolute or position fixed, which you'll see we will use in a little bit. Now we can also change and add some other properties to background. So for instance, background -size, we can change this to cover. Now we can actually start to see a little bit of that shoe. All right. We can also do background position -x, for instance, which is left and right, 20%. So we can kind of move around what's viewable. Now we can see more of that shoe. We can replicate this as well, Shift Alt and down, and we can do position Y. Now for a lot of these values, you can have shorthand values as well. In fact, background right here, if we can start to add some of these same values and just put cover here instead of explicitly stating it here. So know that you do have those options. So Y will put 20 as well, for instance, just to move it down a little bit. We can also specify, and I'm not sure if this is going to affect anything, overflow hidden. All right, so I had overflow hidden in my reference code. We may actually end up needing that, but for now, I'm just going to comment that out. So to comment a property out so that it doesn't actually work yet, it's still there for your own reference point, put 2 /. All right, so that's good for now. And now let's get back focused on this navigation up here. So let's take a look at our logo. And that logo, let's hit Control B, is right here. It has a class of logo. So we want to reference just that. So we put the class logo. And inside of there, we're going to put color, white. That's the way you change the font color. Font weight, bold, which will use that bolder, the 700 value of that font that we imported. All right, so that's looking good there. Next up, looking at our situation here, we have our header element. So what do we need to do with the actual header element? All right, so if we look back to our design, this whole thing is the header element, this invisible blue square, which we don't see obviously in HTML. But we have 2 elements. We have 2 columns rather, this and the nav element. We had to make it so that those are not underneath each other like they currently are in the browser, but side by side. We don't want rows, we want columns for these 2 elements. So the way we do that is we say header and we say display flex. Notice how they kind of they're next to each other now, right? We can also do justify content space between. Now that pushes it out. All right, so we're getting somewhere. So display flex is a way to structure your layout. There's also a value called grid, which grid, which we will also use. Now, they each have advantages, but the grid is pretty powerful. But for just quick, simple things like this, put 2 columns, I like to use the grid, or the flex rather, flex box as it's called. If you want to learn more about both of those things, there's entire courses on them. So again, crash course this is. All right, so that's pretty good right there. And now what we want to do is, by default, we don't want this right here. Let me reset this browser zoom. We don't want that right there. We want just this little hamburger menu. We need to hide this element right here. So how would we do that? Well, let's go in and let's specify, and let's first reference this. Where is this at? Okay, these are both inside here. We have a close button. Oh, I don't think I actually, let me see here. I want to make sure I structure my HTML correctly because maybe I actually didn't. Yeah, I didn't. Okay. And so actually what we want to do is take this menu element and we want it outside of nav. My bad. We're going to have the close SVG element a little bit later inside of the actual nav, but for now we're just going to leave it like this. Okay. So now these are all stack 3 because we have 3 elements that are in here, 1, 2, and 3, and it's created, the display flex has created 3 elements essentially. Now we need to hide this navigation in a second, but for now let's go ahead and get this styled out because it's way too large clearly. So to do that, we're going to take in and take a look at the elements we need to, there we go. Yeah, it's going to be SVG. So if we look at our header right here, we have a single SVG inside of here. All right, so what we'll do is we'll say SVG. Now this is where we're nesting for the first time, I believe. Yep, which is a feature of Sass. So this means any SVG elements inside of header, this right here, this rule set will only apply to them. If there was an SVG outside a header, like down here somewhere, this rule set that we're about to create would not apply to it. So we're going to say width 3 em units. We'll save that. And that's a good size right there. Margin top. So margin, there's a shorthand for margin. So you could do margin alone and just say, and specify the 4 different values if you want. So top, right, bottom, left, like a clock. Or we could say margin top, we'll say negative 0.6 em units. So you can actually do negative values. And we could do cursor pointer here. Now that doesn't look like it's right location, right? That's because of this element. And we need to try to hide that. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose maybe just above here. We're going to put in nav. Now we could just do display none. And that, almost is pretty much that gets rid of it, right? And that's what we want. And we could do that. But there's another way to hide this situation here. And the way to do that is we can use the transform property and kind of just push it off the side of the page. For now, we're going to leave this at display none though. And you'll see why in a little bit, but we want to get things structured up just a bit more here. And I want to at least finish this portion. All right, so then we'll work on that navigation. All right, so if we want to get this all structured up, because clearly this is way too close to the logo. I think it needs to be larger, and this big old thing that needs fixed as well. So what we'll do is reference here. So we have a section called hero, and let's reference this section alone. So what we do is we could put hero, or we could do section.hero, which means it's also specifying the HTML element and the hero element in there. And I like to do that just as a reference point sometimes. It gives it more context essentially. So color white, that means any type elements inside of that element is going to be white. We can do also, let's do a height here of 90 viewport height. And this will become important when it comes to scaling this SVG element and positioning it. So let's take that SVG element inside of there, and let's make the stroke white. And then we could also make the fill white as well. Or is it fill? Let's see here, because SVG, you have to specify the background a little bit differently. So if we look at our down arrow right here, that's because the way we change the fill here, it's specified in the path attribute. So path fill white. There we go. All right, so we've done that. And also, we did give it a class of down arrow. So technically what we could do is we could say right here, change this from SVG to down -arrow. Notice if I save it, it works just the same. And we can also size it a little bit or adjust the width. So what we could say is we could say position absolute and also bottom 2em. And we need to get this scaled down big time. So to do that, what we'll do is just put in a width right here. And we'll just put 1 em unit. And there it is, way much smaller. All right, and I think that's pretty good right there. So now next up, let's also focus on this element, this type element. So we're gonna put in H1, and we're gonna say font size 3 rem units, which would be 3 × 16, which I'm not sure what it is off the top of my head. I'm terrible. We're also gonna do margin top 2 em units, really push it down. And then also we can adjust the leading or the line height with the line height property. We'll say 3.3 rem units. Now you may be wondering, how do I know all these values offhand? Well, sometimes you can refer back to your Figma document and then click on it, and then it'll kind of give you the pixel values, and you can do some math to convert it to em or rem, or you can just eyeball it. Sometimes it's just all about eyeballing things and just adjusting these values as is. So I already prepared this document before. I have a reference code on a reference monitor. It makes the tutorial go much smoother than rather you sitting here watching me fumble around and adjusting values. Sometimes people get mad, they're like, why are you, not doing that? So that's the answer, because it's not clean watching me. It's already difficult doing this as is. Now let's also reference our subhead, which is right here, a subhead class, because that needs to be a little bit larger. So subhead will be font size 1.4 rem units. And I think that's looking pretty good right there. All right, so right now, all this doesn't look good, but this looks a lot better than what we had before, clearly. So now let's get this menu up. And when we click on this, a menu is supposed to show up. What does that menu look like? So we need to style that menu right now. And that menu is defined within our nav element. So that's why we're going to go back to our nav element and take off display none. Now let's just pretend somebody clicked on this element and it shows up a navigation somewhere. So what we'll do is we were going to use position fixed. Fixed means when I scroll down, guess what? It doesn't go away. It stays right there, which is what you want with this type of navigation on mobile. Well, we want to position this to the right. It's going to slide in actually from the right. We're going to say right 0. All right. And then we're going to say top 0. And then we're going to go ahead and give it height 100 viewport height. Now we can't really see the difference there until we give it a background. So I'm going to remove that and I'll show you. Background is white. Now we're going to say height 100 viewport height. There you go. Next up, we're going to make the width about half, or 50%, because you can use percentage values as a unit, which is relative to the size of the browser or the device that you're viewing it on. And save it right there. Now we can see it's given us enough space for a navigation. And then we'll also do Z index 2 to make sure it is sitting on top of this white text, because you want this navigation to make sure it goes over everything. So you might actually want to make this a really high value, like 999, just to be careful. So then also text transform uppercase allows us to take all this type and make it uppercase. All right. So now nested inside of our nav element is the unordered list element. So let's do that. UL, enter. Sometimes the Emmet abbreviations don't work like you want to. So UL for unordered list, we're going to say list style type is none. That gets rid of these little black circles. We're also going to get rid of default padding, because browsers will add a little bit of padding on the left side of these list items. So if we save that, pushes it all the way over here to the left. And then we're also going to push it away from the top by about 8 em units, so 8 times 16. It's really pushing it away because we are going to have a little close button up here. Now, then we want to style these right here because these look bad. Purple default color is bad, and they're also too small and too close together. So we're going to take A, which means all the A elements, or the link elements inside of our unordered list. Because if you recall, we have list item, then we have A inside of that. So for these links, we're going to put color black. We're going to do padding. So another way we can put margin and padding is we can put top and bottom values by put 7.5 em units. And then the right and left values can be 2 em units. All right. Then we're going to display block. Now watch what happens to them. So padding on a link element won't work unless it is display block. All right. So hopefully that makes sense. Now we're also going to do width of 100%. And now that doesn't seem to change anything, but if we also add a hover state, which we can do through Sass by putting an : hover, that means on this A element, we're going to have a hover rule set just for when the cursor hovers over it. We can say background gray. We're not actually going to leave it gray, but I'm going to hit save. Now look at that. Now if I remove width 100%, oh, it actually still works. I thought it was not going to work. I think display block will automatically make it that. So okay. Now we could take this. I think that's too much gray. We want it to be really light. So if we just hover over that black value, we can just use this here to choose a value with our cursor. So if we hit save, look at that. That's a lot better to have a nice little hover effect. Now let's get that close button working here. So in Figma, I'm going to right click and I'm going to use a plugin that I've installed. If you go to Manage Plugins or Browse Plugins in Community, you can use an actual plugin called Iconify. So Iconify, after you get that installed, if you want to follow along, type in close and you'll see all these. So I like this one. Let's go ahead and just drag that. And we want it to be black already, so we right click and we do this, copy as SVG. All right, so we go back to our HTML and we're going to put it right here. Now we're going to get rid of width and height, class equals close, and I believe that is what I did in my reference code. It is. Just to make sure this is all working. I think it won't matter. I'm going to put it at the top because that's how it is in my reference code. All right, we're going to save that. And now you can see it's showing up, but we have to actually be able to position it now because it's not in the right area. So underneath here, I'm going to put in close. And in close, we're going to put float right, which is a way just to kind of push something over on the right side. And we can also do margin 2 em units. And then also width 2.5 em units. And I think that's good right there. So this is our actual full mobile navigation when a person clicks on it. So now we need to hide it. So remember, I didn't want to hide it through display none because I want to be able to animate it in, kind of have it come in when we get to that portion in a bit near the end of this video. So what we'll do is we're going to use transform to hide it. So what we can do is put on the nav element, transform, translate X 100%. It's gone. We no longer see it. And then what we can also do, just for future reference, is transition. Transition is a way to specify what type of property should animate from one point to another. So when we create a little bit of JavaScript, when a person clicks this element, we're going to change this transform property from translate X 100% to 0. All right, so we want this to animate. So we put transition and we put in transform. We'll say for a duration of 0.5 seconds, half a second. And we'll have some ease in out, which can affect how the animation looks. For now, we're not going to see that. For now, we can't click on it. It doesn't work. We'll get that working later on because we need to finish up the rest of this, which we're actually pretty close to doing that already. All right, so next up, we're going to focus on our more info section, which is right here. All right, so let's reference that. It's coming all the way down here. We're actually getting close to having this part finished, or at least the mobile CSS, the mobile first CSS. So more info, actually, we don't necessarily even have a rule set for that, but we can just reference this stuff inside of here. We can say image. So all of our images, we're going to make them responsive with 100%. Notice that got rid of that horizontal scroll bar, so we don't have that scroll issue anymore showing up. Oh, and also Control B. I do want to change these. That's 2. This is going to be 3, and this is going to be 4. That way we have different shoes showing up. And I'm also going to change another thing. Notice how there are different proportions right now. This is real tall. This is kind of like a square, and so is that one. If we change this to object fit-cover and also give it an explicit height of like 11 em units, guess what? It changes the element, the images, this object fit cover. For instance, if I remove object fit cover, it kind of distorts them, right? If we add that, it keeps them there. Very, very cool. Next up is our titles, which is a class of title. Font weight is going to be bold. And why is that affecting there as well? Oh, it's because we forgot to, I rather forgot to change that. This should be description, or DESC for description. There we go. And also, we'll change the font size, make it a little bit larger to reinforce what's called visual hierarchy. That's a UI design idea, or design idea in general, actually. And then also our DESC, or descriptions, line height. We're going to adjust the leading, or the line height, to 1.5 rem units, and that kind of just slightly tidies it up a little bit. And there we go. This is the actual mobile design. Now here's the problem. If we review this on a tablet or even a desktop, this is what the design looks like. It looks like garbage. That's why we have media queries, or responsive design. So now what we do is we ask ourselves, at what point should we start to readjust this layout so that it looks good on a tablet, or something like that? So many times, if you're a front-end developer, a UI designer will have thought of this already, or a UI UX designer. And they might provide you with a prototype to say, hey, this is what this looks like here on a tablet. Code it for us to make it work. Here's what it looks like on desktop. So the way we start to adjust this is through what's called media queries. Here's what a media query looks like. Control B to get rid of that. We're going to do @media, only screen and then parentheses, minimum width, or min width, and we'll say 680 pixels. Now that's confusing as all hell, but basically what this means, this whole rule set, what this means is that once we get to 680 pixels, only the rule sets that are going to be defined inside of here, that are nested in there, are going to count. So at minimum width, all right? So anything underneath that, which is like this stuff over here, will get counted. All right, so if you were to do desktop first, you'd be changing this to max width. But I like min width better, so do many other people. All right, so how do you know what is 600 pixels though? 680 pixels. Like, is it here? Is it there? Well, if you use your dev tools, I hit print screen by accident rather. Hit F12. If we start to scale this in and out, you can see on the very upper right corner, it's probably hard to see in this video, but it'll show you the width and height. So the width is changing. So 680 is like right around there. We're going to make some changes right around there. So basically, this design is going to look like this only up until this point. So what are we going to change? Well, we're going to change something very simple. We're going to give ourselves more white space, which means on the body element, we're going to take our margin element and we're going to grow this to something higher. All right, so let's just copy this real quick. We're going to come down, paste it in, and We're going to leave 1.5 M units on the top and bottom, but on the left and right, we're going to really bump that sucker up to 5 M units. So let's save that and look at that. So watch what's really cool. We're down here. We're underneath 680. This is not counted yet. We're approaching 680 rapidly, and watch. Just like that. It's magic. And so it doesn't seem like much, but once you start adding more role sets, you can drastically change the entire appearance of the layout through properties here, or role sets rather. So that's the only change we're going to make there at that breakpoint, as it's called, with this media query. So they're called breakpoints. All right, so at what point next do we want to start adjusting things? Well, I'm going to say it's probably going to be around 920 pixels. One thing you have to ask yourselves, at what point do we have enough room to put our 3 links and get rid of this hamburger menu, as it's called? Probably even right here we could put it, but we're just going to put it right at 920 pixels, or like right around here or so. Arguably, we can go much lesser than that, but that's how I have my code structured. So let's just copy this stuff. So we have to rewrite it again. We're going to put 920 here, and then we're going to get rid of this. So what we do is we take a look. This right here has a class of, it's SVG, menu. So we hide it. So we say menu, display, none. Now, we get out to 920, watch it hide. See how it hides? Very cool. Now, we take our nav, which is currently pushed off to the side of the screen with transform, translate X 100%. What we say is nav, we are going to transform, and we're going to translate X 0. All right, so let's pull this out. Now here's the problem. It's showing up, but it's showing our actual mobile version of the menu. It's not showing the menu right. If I can get it up, it's not showing this menu. It doesn't look like that, right? Well, that means we're going to have to rewrite some of this, the properties, to override this stuff and make it so that it looks like that Figma document. So here's how we do that. Remember, is position fixed? We were going to change that and override that by putting position unset. So now we're getting somewhere slightly. We're going to put display block. We're going to put width auto. We're going to put height auto. And we're going to put background none. We're getting close. As you can see, we've overwritten a lot of stuff here. Now, with our close, we don't need this close button because this is always going to be there on desktop. So what we can do is we can come down here, svg.close. We can say display none. All right. Then our unordered list, which is defined as an UL element, we're going to say display flex. Remember, display flex on a parent container, any child elements inside of it that are nested in it will become columns. And we want them, we want them in 3 columns. So display flex. All right. And then we're also going to put margin 0. So that gets rid of the default margin from the unordered list, or it actually wasn't default. We defined a margin to push it down in that mobile. So now we're just resetting it to 0. Then we take our actual links. We say color white because we can't see them barely as they are. And then we also specify a padding. Let me move this, get this out of the way. We'll put padding of 0.5 on the top and bottom and 1.5 on the left and right. Then font size, we're going to make it a little bit smaller to 0.9 rem units. Look at that. Now the hovers. We don't want hovers like that because we can barely see the type when you hover. So, and hover. And we simply say background none. And maybe we want a different type of hover. So we'll do text decoration, underline, which brings back the links. So when we underline it, there we go. We have a visual indicator that we're hovering over this particular element. Whew. All right, I know that was a lot just for that navigation. So weird things are happening now, but don't worry, we'll fix that once we get this working and we start to work through things. All right, so next up, what about the hero image? If we refer back to our design, you'll see we have this desktop version showing up where it's no longer fully consuming the layout. It's basically halfway. So let's work on that. So after our, let's see here, I want to make sure I am doing everything correctly. Yeah, coming out here, this right here, this final closing bracket is still within this media query. So we still want to stay in there. And so we'll say our hero -img. We're going to say left is going to be unset. So we're just unsetting that value that was placed on there initially. We're also going to say right is 0 because we want to push this thing over to the right. And then the width will be 50%. All right. So let's hide this for a second. So we're getting close. And we'll also give it an explicit height. And I've chosen 42 em units. So we're kind of just writing it in. It's no longer going to be based on the height of the browser. All right, so that's looking pretty good to me for now. All right. Next up is our logo. We lost it because it's white, and it's currently white on white. So we're going to say logo, color black. There it is. And then remember, we wanted to make brand red. So we can just put span because we used that span element. And we'll say color red. So there's multiple ways, by the way, to specify the value of color. You can put red, white, blue, and all these different colors. You can also put in hex values with a hashtag. You can do RGB, you can do HSL. There's a lot of different ways, just so you know. All right. After that, we're going to take our hero section and make all this stuff black text. So coming outside of here, we're going to do hero. We'll say color black. Let's do section.hero. That's because we specified that rule set as section.hero above. So there was a specificity issue. Okay, I'm not even going to try to say it. Specificity is an issue can really screw people up. I'm not even going to touch on that very much, but what we just experienced was an issue with that. So because I used section hero before and not just hero, that's why it wasn't working. All right, height, we're going to set this to auto. And then also we're going to do a width of 40% just to kind of move this stuff in a little bit away from there. And then also a margin bottom to push that stuff down by 8 em units. All right, next up is we have this little, the down arrow, which is white on white, which is why we don't see it. So we're going to put in SVG. We're going to make stroke black this time instead of white. We're going to put position unset as well because there was a position set there. And then also the path fill is black. So let's save that. And we don't see it still. Why is that? All right, so that's a little bit strange because it's not aligning up with my reference code. So again, I'm going to work through this just so you can show this is inevitably, it's going to happen to you 100% of the time, even if you've been doing this for 20 years. It's very rare to get something that goes smooth. So where is our down arrow? It is, okay, so it's down arrow, it's SVG, it's in section class hero, and it's not being overwritten. So svg.down-arrow. There we go. So that was, again, one of those issues with being specific. I'm not even going to try to say the name. There we go. Now that's working and everything's looking a lot better. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to style this area, and this is where we're going to put each one of those in 2 columns. So if we go back to our reference design, we'll see each one has its own parent. We'll make that a display grid, And then these will be a column, and this will be a column. And then we'll use the grid to flip and reverse these. So next up, what we'll do is we put in feature, which again is the parent container of each of these elements. Again, just to show you, feature right there. So we're going to make it a display grid. And then what we'll do is grid template columns. Tire videos and crash courses on the grid. I've done several of them actually. We're going to put repeat to auto. All this is saying is essentially that the grid template columns only works if you have this as a display grid. That's the parent container. And then what we'll say is we're going to use this repeat function. It says simply just to repeat each of these columns with these values. We want 2 of them, and they're going to be situated as auto. All right. Next up, we're going to put a gap of 3 em units between them. You can see how it just basically puts white space between the columns themselves. And then also we'll put a margin bottom of 8 em units to push them away from each other. Now, next up, we have our image inside of them, those shoes. We're going to say width 25 em units. So now they're all the same. All right, now we're getting close. Next up for the content, we're going to say text align right with the width of 25 em units as well. So now they're all right aligned, and this is fine. You could leave it like this, but we're going to do this flip-floppy reverse thing. The way we do that is we're going to come outside of here, feature left, which is in relation to feature left here. And what we say is grid template areas. I know this is getting confusing, but this will all come to you eventually if you stick with it enough. We're going to put left, right. So we're basically naming our columns within the display grid. Then we take our image and we say grid area is left. All right. Now it's just reverse those. Now we also want to left align this type right here. So let's close this out, and we're going to say the content inside of feature left, that's what that means, is going to be text align left. There we go. And then we're also going to give that a specific width as well to make sure everything is evened up between all 3 columns, 25 em units, and justify self will be left as well. So now when we pull this up, everything is starting to look pretty decent. All right. Okay, so at this point, we're going to make another adjustment here. So if I pull this out and I get F12 for our developer console, I think at about 1200 pixels, I want to confine this design and make it centered. So what I mean by that, if we stretch this all the way out, I mean, it is large. I don't really like the looks. So we're going to take that wrapper element, which we haven't applied any styling to in our CSS yet, and we're going to apply it in yet a new media query. So let's go up here just to grab this code. So we're going to have a third breakpoint or a third media query, the very bottom, and this is going to be for the size of 1200 pixels. Now nothing happens because nothing's inside of it. So inside of it, we're going to take a wrapper. We're going to say width is 1200 pixels. So we're giving it an actual defined width and a margin of 0 auto, which is a very quick way of centering elements. So you put margin 0 at the top and bottom, left and right, you put auto, and that just keeps it centered. So watch what happens now. So when we go beyond 1200, look how this whole thing is staying the same. It's no longer resizing based on, it's no longer fluid based on the size of the browser. That way the layout just doesn't get too disconjointed, so to speak. Now, also, I'm going to go ahead and change, look at all this white space here. That's because of the gap property. So what we can do is just say feature gap 0. So now that just kind of brings them in closer together. All right, awesome stuff. Next up is the next section of this video. Now we're going to apply some animation to our design here. All right, so let's say, for instance, we want our image to animate in somehow. Maybe we want it to kind of just like fall down and like kind of just give us a cool sort of animation. So what we're going to do is we're going to visit our hero image all the way up here outside of the media queries. And we are going to add animation, and we'll say intro load. So that's the name of the animation. We want it to be for 2 seconds long, and we'll say forwards because we only want it to run once. We don't want it to repeat. Oh, there's something. Oh, okay. It's because I never defined the grid area named for right. I was wondering why that kept popping up. You don't have to worry about that though. All right, so we have an animation called intro load. Now let's go define that animation way at the bottom. The way you define a keyframe animation, you put at keyframes, and the name, in our case, is intro load, and we open it up like a regular rule set. So that rule set, what we'll do is we're going to say from, and there's multiple ways to put in these little keyframe rule sets. You can put percentage values. So you can have multi-step animation, like maybe from 0 to 10% it's going to do something, and then from 10% to 50% it'll do something, so on and so forth. But if you just want a simple from and to, you can either use transition or you could use the keyframes as well. So we're going to say from clip path. Now this is another property you've never messed with before, but there's a very cool tool called Clippy, CSS Clippy. Just type that in Google and you'll find this result right here. I've shown it a lot on my channel. So we're going to choose trapezoid, which is just a square or rectangle. We're just move things out, and our starting point for our image is going to be way up here. You're not going to see it. So we're going to copy this declaration right here, and we're going to go back here and we're going to paste it in. And then we're going to say we're going to go back to our browser, pull these back down. We'll copy that. You could make it interesting. Maybe just do something like that or whatever. You can do a ton of stuff, as you can see. We're going to paste that in right there. Look at that once we save. How cool is that? That's how you can create animations, one of many ways. Now, what about this arrow right here? What if we wanted to bob up and down, for instance? Just to kind of give like the eye, like to bring it attention, all right, to the eye. So what we can do is we'll find this is called down arrow. Control F, by the way, if you have a big document, you just type it in and you can find it pretty quickly. Down arrow here, that's in a media query. This one is not. So I'm going to do the same thing in my reference code. And we're going to add another animation. So what we'll do is say animation, move arrow, 1 second, alternate reverse. So that's, instead of putting forwards or infinite, alternate reverse, we're going to go back and forth between the two states. And then we also want it to be infinite. It will just loop on forever and ever. So move arrow. Let's come down. Let's copy this just so we can save ourselves some typing. Move arrow. And then inside of there, same from and to, we can just do transform, translate Y, negative 30 pixels. We're going to move it up 30 pixels. And then we'll copy this and then just put 0. Save it. And look at that. It's bobbing up and down all nicely. So if you change the duration and stuff, it can go really fast or really slow. All right, very, very, very cool. All right. Also, we also want to get our navigation working. I believe, before we get to that point, let's make this stuff fall in and like fade in. All right, so what we'll do in order to do that is we're going to create another animation called move arrow. not move arrow, I'm sorry. It's called move down rather. So I'm going to search for that on my reference code. So on section hero, there we go. We're going to put in animation, move down, 1 second, ease in and out. So you can create custom easings which affect the flow of the actual design, or the animation rather, and then forwards. We only want that to happen once. And then let's also change the opacity to 0. It's going to hide it right now. We're not going to see it anymore. Opacity is how you can just hide things. So then we come all the way down. We create move down. And then move down, what we'll do is simply say translate or transform, translate Y, -100 pixels. And then we'll leave it at 0 here. And then opacity 1. Remember, we hit it. So now we're going to bring back the, oops, we have an issue. Make sure you have your semicolon there if you have more than one declaration. So we'll save it and look at that. Now, isn't that very cool? So let's get this up here. Put this up here. Now, what's also cool is if I bring this out, if I refresh, it still works on desktop as well. How cool is that? It's very cool. The final thing we need to do is some JavaScript. And we'll do a little bit of animation to get that thing to slide in. So when we click this, nothing happens. So this is how we create interactivity, is with JavaScript. Now, this isn't a JavaScript crash course, but we still have to write some of it. So at the typically, if you're going to do what's called inline JavaScript, which means writing JavaScript inside of your HTML file, you don't have to. You can also link an extra file called a .js file. But we're going to do it here. So we're going to type in script in there. JavaScript goes in here. HTML and all CSS does not go in there. CSS in JavaScript is a thing, but that's different. That's another topic. So what we're going to do here is just create some variables, or constants as they're called. We're going to say const menu, and we're going to say document.querySelector. And what we're trying to do is just create a reference or a variable that will allow us to determine when this is clicked. So this has a class of menu. So we put in menu. Now we're going to replicate this 2 more times because we also need access to the close button. So we double click that and we change that to close. And then also the nav element, which is currently hidden off, that big white long element. So we're going to change that to nav. And this one is not a class, so we remove the period and just put nav. So first thing, when somebody clicks this, which is our menu, we say menu.add event listener. So there's a bunch of different types of events that can occur. One of them is click. So we open up in parentheses and a semiquote and the first parameter as click. Then we put a comma which separates your parameters. And we're going to put empty an argument here. We're not going to pass anything in, and we put in what's called an arrow function, and then we open that up into the squiggly brackets there. And then what we say, what this essentially means, kind of like the in CSS, it's kind of like our media queries right here. This, whatever in here, only happens is if this element is clicked. So what we do is we say nav, which is defined right here. Now that we have access to it, nav dot. And by the way, we could have just done this. We could have just did document.querySelector.nav.ClassList.add. But sometimes to make your code cleaner, this is why you create access to the variables and constants and stuff like that, or properties sometimes as they're called too. So we're going to say nav.ClassList.add. So we're adding a CSS class to it when it's clicked. All right. And we add a class that we have not yet created called open-nav. All right. So let's create that. Now, if I show you real quickly with the dev tools, and we get to a point where we're here, and I hit F12, and I click on this, and we view this. Let's find our nav element. It's somewhere in here. It's in header nav right there. Now, if we look, and I click that, there we go. We click it, class OpenNav has been added to it as an attribute. So that's what happens. Just to show you again, if I click this, there it goes. It adds that. But nothing happens because it's not defined in our CSS yet. So to do that, we're going to go back over right here above our first media query. And we're going to say OpenNav. And we say transform, translate, not translate, translate x 0. Let's put 0%. So now watch what happens. Look at that. Let's refresh. Ta-da. Now if we click close, nothing's happening. Why? You guessed it. We have to go over to here. We'll copy this. Now for this is going to be close. So we add an event listener on close, click. Now we just say remove. Click that, click that. Oh my God. Look at what you just did. And you know what? You probably understand it pretty well. You know what's something that's bothering me? This is looking pretty big. I don't like the look of this. For some reason, it's set in my reference code as that, but that just does not look good. So I think that's called close. Width is 2.5. Let's try 2. Or wait, is that not working? Let's make sure. Oh, was that in a media query or not? No, it wasn't. So let's go back here to our code. It's called SVG classes close. All right, so it is close right here with 1em unit. So it's not changing for some reason the value. Oh, sorry about that. That is actually header SVG. So we changed from 3 to like 2.3. And that's a lot better of a size. Alrighty, so sorry about that. There was like a blue tint thing showing up because of my green screen in the background. It's getting dark outside. That is it, essentially. Looking at this, I kind of don't like the amount of, like if we look at, hold on one second here. If I pull this up, it's kind of going a little bit too close here. So what you would do, you could use margin to push this down in order to get that a little bit better aligned up. I'll let you try to do that. But that is essentially front-end development, something a front-end developer would do to take an existing design and make it a working reality in the browser. All right, everybody, hopefully you enjoyed that. And I guarantee you, if you're brand new to this, you don't understand everything, you probably have a lot of questions. If that's the case, please visit designcourse.com/CSS to enter your email to be notified when my brand new interactive CSS course releases. And of course, if you're watching this at a time when it's already released, please consider joining. Check the YouTube description for any available discounts as well. Also, if you're interested in learning how to actually design great looking websites and apps, then definitely check out the UI UX design course at DesignCourse.com. Again, check the YouTube description for any available discounts. I will be quiet now. Hopefully you subscribe here, and I'll see you all soon. Goodbye.